Venice is genuinely a city like no other. Every city has its own personality and individual traits and flavor, but no place on earth is like Venice. And it's of course the canals and the gondolas that you think of and that make it so distinct. But the history and the politics and the culture and everything that came along partially because of that, like the construction and the engineering and the aesthetics, onward to the environmental factors that they struggle with now today, are all just as fascinating, if not more so, than the canals themselves. And they all stem from those founding factors that would lead Venice to become Venice. And what do I mean by those founding factors? Well, Venice is not a remnant of Rome. It was not a great Roman city. You don't look everywhere and see a bunch of Roman statues. Venice became what it is because Rome had fallen. The Visigoths, the Huns, the Lombards were coming down through this part of Italy and onto Rome and sacking and destroying everything. And what little there was in this area got sick and tired of being attacked by these tribes and decided to move from the mainland out to the islands to try and protect themselves from them. And it worked. The Republic of Venice would last 1,100 years as the longest lasting independent state ever in the world. They moved themselves far enough offshore and out of the comfort zone of their attackers to be on the advantage. And they would develop and press those advantages to become one of the greatest powers on earth during that period. But let's skip forward to the present. Nowadays, you can actually get to Venice. There's a rail line and a highway that goes out to Venice, and there's a small area where you can park, get off a boat, get off a train, and then transit onward to Venice. And that's what we did. We were picked up by our private boat, and they took us, just like a taxi, to our hotel in the middle of Venice. Nate and I, being travel buddies, like to give each other a bad time. And as we were arriving in Venice, I was still giving Nate a bad time about the trip that we had had this morning. As we were leaving Madrid to fly to Venice, we were going through airport security, and security stopped him and kept going through his bag over and over again. And they were asking him, "Where's the knife?" And he was looking at them like they were crazy and said, "What knife? I don't have a knife. What are you talking about?" And they kept insisting that there was a knife. And it was ridiculous. And at some point, Nate says to the guy, "Look, I don't have a knife." And right about that time, he pulled the knife out of the bag. And it actually really wasn't a knife. It was one of these little Victorinox travel cards that has a bunch of little tools in it. But one of the tools was a stainless steel knife. It's basically a pocket knife. And Nate had no idea it was in that bag. It was supposed to be in his checked bag, and somehow it got in his carry-on bag. But that's what they had been looking for because they saw it on the x-ray. And so at that point, we were both kind of like, oh, geez, can't believe it. Something so silly that you would never expect. So we're like, okay, yeah, go ahead. There you go. There it is, And they were like, no, we have to call the police. So they literally called the police over, and the police came and took Nate into the back room. And I'm standing there thinking, oh my goodness, pocket knife here. And so they had him in the back room for a while, and let me interrupt myself here just for a second to point out that's the Rialto Bridge in the distance across the Grand Canal, which we're on here. It's one of the most famous points in Venice, and we'll see it later, but we're passing it here, so back to my story. It ended up really being nothing, and they were really just trying to determine which one of the guys got to keep the knife. But of course, I didn't let him live it down. I was going to give him a bad time about it, about the felon that I'm traveling with. Of course, it would come back to bite me because he would start giving me a bad time later. As we were leaving Venice, he had the upper hand because we were driving and we went through up to this toll booth, and we get there and it's all in Italian. There's nothing to be done. You can't tell what you're supposed to do. we're just sitting there, and there are all these cars behind us, and they're honking, and I don't know what to do at the toll booth. And I'm hitting buttons trying to get a person on the intercom, and finally the gate just opens, and I just drive through because people were honking, and we were stuck. We didn't know what to do. And Nate just looks at me. And so for the entire rest of the Italian trip, he was looking up above out the windows like, what are you looking at? And he's like, I'm looking for the helicopters. I'm just waiting for them to come after you. We're on the run. It's like Smokey and the Bandit. So every time we'd see the police, I would tell him they're looking for him, and he'd say, no, they're looking for you. So, but anyway, that's just what we do. We give each other a bad time. So when friends back home would ask, how's the trip going? I'm like, well, Nate got arrested, and I've got warrants out for my arrest. So, what else is new? Most people stay outside of Venice, and they just come in for the day and then leave. And if you're staying inside Venice, you have to figure out how to get to your hotel. So there are basically three options. There are large water taxis, and you can take one of those to a large water taxi stand and then walk to your hotel with your luggage. Or if you're lucky and there are some stairs nearby your hotel, you can get off from a small boat closer and then walk. Or if you're really lucky, like us here at this hotel, your hotel has a dock. Ours is located in a little basin next to St. Mark's, which is right through that little passageway there. And it's a great area because it's so close to St. Mark's, but it's also popular with gondolas, and many of the gondola rides start from here. So I've mentioned St. Mark's. What is that, and where are we? The entirety of Venice is packed with historical sites and things to see, but there are two significant landmarks that stand out above all others: the Rialto Bridge and St. Mark's Square. St. Mark's Square in particular is just packed with famous sites, so let's look at it. You have Piazza San Marco, which is St. Mark's Square right here in the middle. You also have Piazzetta San Marco, which is separate, but people call it the same thing. You have the Doge's Palace. You have the church, which is the Basilica San Marco. And I'm going to show you each of these things, but I'm just pointing out where things are. This is the Campanile. People call it the clock tower. It's not. It's the bell tower for the church. The clock tower is actually over here. It's a separate, unrelated thing, but people confuse them. These buildings over here are a bunch of very large and very cool museums in the Cafe Florian. And then here we have our hotel, which is where we are now. So that kind of gives you a lay of the land, at least. And we specifically chose this hotel because you go out the door at 50 feet, you're in the middle of St. Mark's. It doesn't get any better than that. So here we are. We're in Italy. Food everywhere. Italian food. We were hungry too. And the first thing we did was eat an American cheeseburger. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. The food was actually very good in Venice and all over Italy. I don't even remember how we ended up eating a cheeseburger that first day. I think it was because we were in the middle of St. Mark's and it's all touristy and it's like the worst place you really want to try and find a place to eat is right in the middle of St. Mark's Square. But we did, and but we also later on ate at Cafe Florian, or had a coffee actually. And Cafe Florian is the oldest cafe in the world. The people that go there take it very seriously. I mean, it's like a destination for some people. I guess it's the Italian version of English high tea. And then, of course, you have Nate and I wandering in just for a cup of coffee. So, can we get 2 coffees, please? It was neat to go see. Although 2 coffees were $42. So that's a bit ridiculous, but hey, whatever. It's welcome to Venice. But let's leave St. Mark's for the moment and go to the Grand Canal and the Rialto Bridge so we can talk about ships. The Venetians were able to build ships on a scale like no one else. Their complex of shipyards lasted 700 years, starting in the 1100s, until the Industrial Revolution. It was the origin of the assembly line. We talk about Henry Ford coming up with the assembly line. Well, he came up with the moving assembly line, but everyone credits him for this. No, the Venetians were doing it for 700 years. They could make a warship in a day. In 1570, for example, they built a fleet to fight the Turks. In 2 months, they built 100 warships. This level of sophistication and industrialization would not be seen for 700 years until the Industrial Revolution. From big boats to little boats, let's talk a minute about the gondola. The gondola is the iconic symbol of Venice, obviously, but it's an actual practical thing that they use. It is the way to get around Venice, and always has been. There used to be as many as 10,000 gondolas in Venice. Now there's only about 400. And probably less than 600 gondoliers. But they can make $150,000 a year. The boats cost between $40,000 and $100,000. Most of them are around $40,000. That's a lot of money. And to be a gondolier, not just anyone can be one. You have to have a license, and it's very difficult to get, almost impossible. You have to buy a license. They cost several €100,000. And the city only gives out a handful of them every decade. Maybe only 12 at a time. The gondoliers own their boats and run their business. A gondola ride costs about €80 for 20 to 30 minutes. The gondolier is the very definition of a dying business, unfortunately. And in many ways, Venice is a dying city. Tourism is the driving force behind modern Venice, and it's killing Venice. That's something we heard over and over again all over Italy from the tour guides who actually make their living from tourism. They were telling us themselves that over-tourism is killing their cities. There are only about 50,000 people who actually live in Venice nowadays. They just can't afford to live there. And everybody blames Airbnb instantly. And it's true, but it is also much more complicated than that. There are many other factors. It's just too difficult to live in a city like Venice nowadays if you're a local. But the way the city was constructed itself is also problematic. It's a city built on water. It's actually built on islands, but basically it's 3 square miles of 116 islands that they pounded piles into the ground around the islands, then filled it up with mud and stone, and then built on top of that. But the whole thing is 1 foot above sea level. The weight of the city itself is just driving the piles into the ground because everything is saturated with water. Starting in the 1300s, the Venetians knew they had a problem already. Just from the rivers coming down, the silt would pile up. They would have to dredge. The rivers would alter their paths. They would have to build dams. So they started manipulating their environment heavily in the 1300s to try and save the city. And it's been an engineering battle ever since. Add to the sinking the fact that this area is prone to a tidal phenomenon where the waters can rise as much as 6 feet. Remember, you're talking about a city that's built 1 foot off the water, and the waters can rise 6 feet and flood the city, which has happened countless times over hundreds of years. And people think that the floods are caused by rain. They're not. They're actually caused by the tides, the winds, and low atmospheric pressure. That's not as easy to engineer your way out of. They've been looking for solutions for hundreds of years. They settled on one called the Mose Project in 1984, and it's been under construction ever since. It's been plagued by delays and corruption and funding issues, but it actually went into implementation in 2020. The idea is to bring in massive barriers to close off the 3 points where the lagoon accesses the sea. They're sunk into the ground, and then they're filled with air to raise up out of the water to shut off the sea. These are the barriers. They're massive, the size of a house. The mounts that mount them into the seabed they swivel, and they're mounted into caissons, which are the size of large buildings sunk into the seabed. The whole system went live in 2020 when they had to use it to prevent a flood, and it worked. So far it's been successful, but it's extremely expensive. It costs millions of dollars every time they have to raise them, and nobody knows for how long this will work. Well, here we are back in St. Mark's Square. There's the clock tower, and there's the basilica. And I want to show you pictures of the basilica and the Doge's palace. But I want to talk more about the Republic of Venice and its government, not just the buildings. But while we have the basilica coming up here, let's talk about it for just a second. It's a fascinating building because it's so chaotic and wild and weird, and there's columns of different colors and different styles. And why? It's because Venice had its feet stuck in the east and the west, and this was as much Byzantium as it was Western Europe, and most of this stuff was actually stolen from other places, like the sack of Constantinople, by the way. The Republic was sitting there at the top of the Adriatic, straddling those Eastern and Western worlds. And when I say Eastern, I'm not talking about East as in Asia. I'm talking about the Byzantium and even the Arab lands in the south, North Africa. You know, they're at a crossroads of all these different places. And that was one of the things that made them so powerful, of course, is they were at this nexus for all these trade routes, equal to things like their geography and their navy and the things that make Venice Venice is the Republic. What the Venetians call La Serenissima. And it stands for the most serene Republic of Venice or something like that. But the serenity, Serenissima, is what they call their Republic years. And it's one of the most fascinating things about Venice, because their form of government was so complicated and in many ways egalitarian. And I know people are going to hate it when I say that and when I call it democratic. You know, we're talking about the 11, 12, 13, 1400s, and I'm calling it democratic. Okay, no, it wasn't in modern terms, but for the time and compared to every place else, it was very democratic. And they made efforts and strides to be democratic. But there were other elements to it that were fascinating as well. They had checks and balances. They had councils. The Doge, everyone talks about the Doge and how he was the most powerful figure in Venice. Well, he was kind of, but he couldn't do anything without the councils. And the councils couldn't do anything without him. And the council and the Doge couldn't do anything without the Council of Ten or the Inquisitors. These were all groups set up to check each other and to make sure that nobody had too much power, and more importantly, that nobody was corrupt. They despised corruption almost as much as they despised spies. Everything was secret. There was a lot of espionage and intrigue, and they were constantly trying to maintain their technological advantage in glass and in the Navy and these other things, and they were worried about secrets getting out. Their legal system was extensive and largely considered to be just. They had letterboxes where any citizen could charge any official with a crime, and it would be investigated. This is the Bridge of Sighs, one of the most famous sites in Venice. That bridge is where prisoners were taken from the courts to the prisons. The legend was that their loved ones would go to that bridge down there and hope to catch a glimpse of them as they went across, the sighs being possibly the last thing that they ever heard from them. Just one more of the interesting, fascinating, weird things about Venice. It's just such a neat and interesting city. And as I said at the very beginning, just someplace like no other. I didn't even talk about things like the museums. Maybe I can put some of those things up in a short, separate video.